Here we go. So, what I want to talk about today is how gut health is whole system health. And a lot of times we really think of the scenario where we're trying to create health and we realistically are only working on one system. And in some ways, I think that's really the frustration with Western medicine today is that we often see that we're only working on one thing and the right hand isn't comparing or talking to the left hand. And so a lot of times we're realizing that, it's almost as if the care is siloed and not making any sense to people because if your back is getting treated, the rest of your body is being ignored and ill effects can happen in other places. So I want to come back to a concept that's whole system health, and that is that every system affects every other system. But what's incredible and what we're going to talk about today is why gut health is so much the foundation that sort of ties the whole system together. The gut has a set list of duties, if you want to put it that way. It's supposed to digest and absorb nutrients so that we have nutrition in our body, give us all the ingredients that we need for our system. And then secondly, there's a microbial balance that the gut really is the orchestrator of. It is the entity, I guess, in our body that makes sure that all of the bacteria that really have many, many jobs to do in our system are working together and in balance. And I like to say there's supposed to be about 80% good guys, and maybe there's often up to 20% what we would think of as bad guys. There's also a barrier function. The gut is your sort of barrier wall between the outside world and the inside world. It's where everything that we would be exposed to in the outside world comes into our system, and our gut does a sorting job. It looks for whether or not this is something useful, something that needs to be sent on and excreted from the body, or whether it's a toxin and the body needs to very quickly get rid of it. So all of that happens at the barrier level. And then there's also that detoxification and elimination that I just alluded to, of a whole system that knows what it needs to hold on to, what it needs to transform, and what it ought to get rid of as well. So I promised that there would be 3 practical tips during our talk today, and this is tip number 1. Chew your food at least 25 times. Now, that is not a revolutionary thought, but I will tell you, in studying this for myself, this has become one of the most profound, simple things that you can do. One of the top 2 medications, as far as a group of medications that we take in this country, are the antacids for our stomach. And there are so many people that have GERD. We all now know what GERD means. And, it's like this has become a phenomenon that depression and heartburn and reflux are the things that everybody has in this country. One of the reasons we have this problem is we have not been chewing our food. So if you imagine, and I can hear my mother telling me, chew your food 30 times, she would say. And last night, as I was preparing this talk, I sat and tried chewing 25 times, and it takes mindfulness to chew 25 times. But what happens when you chew your food is you break it down into small particles, and the saliva mixes with that food. And that actually starts chemical digestion. It starts literally transforming the food so that it's ready for the next step in your stomach, where the hydrochloric acid is supposed to then mix with the food and start the digestive process in the next phase. So the other thing that is incredible in our saliva is we have something called SIGA. And I like to say that our immune system has multiple branches, kind of like we have multiple branches of the military. And one of the branches of the military are the scouts. And the scouts are in the SIGA, which is in your saliva. And so as soon as you mix that saliva with your food, your immune system starts to get activated to know whether or not this is something you can tolerate, whether it's something that's friend or foe, and how it's going to need to prepare the remainder of your digestive tract to digest that food. So chew your food at least 25 times is the first tip today that you can do. The intestinal wall has several ways that it provides protection to us between the internal and the external world. I mentioned or alluded to the microbiome, and the microbiome is a term that means all of the bacteria in the human body. There's certainly a bulk of that bacteria in the intestinal tract. In fact, we know that we have more DNA from the bacteria in our gut than we have human DNA in our whole body. So we really are more bacteria than we are human DNA. However, that microbiome is a very intricately balanced community, and in that community, there are all kinds of different actors and roles to be played, where the microbiome keeps us safe and promotes the digestion of our food and the breakdown and the utilization of our food as well. In addition, the intestinal tract has a barrier that is really the wall itself. So in some ways, you can almost think of the protective layers of the intestine being first the microbiome, because they have an alerting system that if something is not healthful for you, that microbiome goes into action. Secondly, the cell walls themselves, just like little bricks in a wall, are actually a guard that doesn't let anything through that doesn't have sort of a lock and key kind of relationship with that cell wall. And then there are junctions between the cells. You could think of those junctions like mortar or glue between the bricks. And so those junctions protect us by making a barrier. The cells make a barrier, and the bacteria make a barrier on the inside of our intestinal lining. There really truly seem to be bacteria everywhere. We know there are at least 1 trillion bacteria in the gut. There's also bacteria on our skin. I had a question yesterday from somebody saying, how do you get an infection in the skin of your ear? And I said, well, a little scratch. And there's bacteria on the skin all the time that any scratch anywhere on our skin potentially could get infected. And so when we look at bacteria, we're going to dig in a little bit more to understand what we can do to help keep our bacteria healthy. I alluded to the microbiome being a term that meant all the bacteria living inside of us. And certainly the majority of that is in the gut, but there is bacteria in every orifice of the body and all over our skin. And there are hundreds of different bacterial species. One of the more recent ventures really in the United States has been to map the microbiome's DNA so that we now have companies coming out that will do testing based on your microbiome DNA so that we can know what foods you tolerate best or what things might be bothering one's system. There's about, like I said, 80 to 90% good guys and 10 to 20% bad guys in the gut. And when that balance is maintained, we actually feel the best and have the best functioning system. The gut microbiota or the microbiome changes from the time we're born until the day we die. When babies are born, there's a completely different gut microbiota in a baby that's born with a vaginal delivery versus a cesarean section. And we're learning that whether we're exposed to breast milk or formula, or whether we have a diet that's high in vegetables as a kid versus processed foods, or even our hormone levels and medications we're exposed to in our life, all of those impact our own gut microbiome family or community. I'm not going to go through every detail of these two studies, but one of the interesting studies that's been done was to look at how different diets create different microbiomes. And if you just look at the pie charts in the center of this slide, you can see the difference between a group of children that were living in a country where they lived in a hut very close to the dirt versus a country where the children were fed a lot more processed foods in Italy. And in essence, the difference is that the more fiber we have in our system, the more plants we have in our system, the more of the beneficial bacterial strains, I guess you could say, we have in our system. And so certainly changing our diet also is a way we can change the microbiome in our system. So practical tip number 2, we've all heard, I suspect that all of us are reading and hearing about fermented food. And I want to talk for a minute about what counts as fermented food and why the benefit for fermented food. So fermented food is one way you can feed and nurture the good guys in your bacteria of your gut, in the microbiome. So fermented food, there's a little list here: fresh pickles, sauerkraut, kimchi, yogurt, kefir. All of those are fermented foods. And the main thing that I would say about that is fresh is better. So if you take sauerkraut and you can it in a can, you will kill all the good bacteria. So canned fermented foods don't count. They have to be fresh. One of the things that's kind of fun, this is a great section that you can Google. And in fact, I believe that there's a fermented food workshop coming up on a weekend locally that if you're interested, touch base with us on Facebook. I'll make sure I post it when that's coming up, that can teach you how to ferment your own food. But it's really as simple as if you were going to make cucumber pickles at home, it's as simple as slicing up cucumbers and putting vinegar on them and letting them sit on the counter for a day. But in essence, fresh pickled foods or fermented foods have a benefit of breaking the food down in a way that makes it a perfect food for the bacteria in your gut. So I've had a number of patients where one of the main interventions we did was to be sure that they got at least a tablespoon of a fermented food daily. So 1 tablespoon of sauerkraut or 1 tablespoon of kimchi or a little glass of kefir each day. With yogurt and some of the kefir products, and actually the kombucha as well, you really want to watch sugar, because if you have a high amount of sugar in that product, you can basically cancel out all the beneficial effect of that fermented food. So look for versions that are either sweetened with stevia or have a very low sugar content. Less than about 8 grams of sugar per serving would be a maximal amount I would think of as permissible. But by feeding the gut microbiome, this is a way you can take your probiotics in your food. And doing this daily can actually literally change your digestive capacity to where you can start to absorb your food better because your microbiome has been engaged to actually start digesting better. This is a cartoon shot of the wall of your small intestine. So in this drawing, the little bubbles sort of towards the top of the picture right here represent bacteria. So this is the microbiome on the inside of your gut wall, kind of like inside the tube or inside the hose of our gut. These purple pinky cells are the cell wall cells of your small intestines, and they are made up of cholesterol actually and proteins. And then these little areas in between represent the glue or the tight junction or the mortar between these cells. On the far side, from if your food's floating along in here where the bacteria are, on the far side of these cells are capillaries that are your bloodstream. And literally the cell walls in the small intestine are one cell layer thick between the food and the capillary. So in explaining a little bit why I put this picture in, I want to mention our gut is an amazing organ. If we were to take our gut wall and lay it out flat and literally flatten out all of these little villi, which are like finger-like projections, those finger-like projections are meant to increase the absorptive capacity or the surface area of the gut. And if we laid all of those out flat, your gastrointestinal tract is the size of a regulation tennis court. So a huge amount of absorptive capacity. But we are born with that kind of capacity because these little villi, these finger-like projections, I like to think of them like shag carpet. They're all sticking out up into the intestine and connecting with the food and the microbiome. If we beat them up, and we do that through antibiotics, through pesticides, through foods that are toxic, through medications, and through certainly even stress actually has a dulling effect on the villi, they become blunted and much more like Berber carpet. So you want to have villi that are like shag carpet, not like Berber carpet. But the villi being healthy and well inside that environment with a healthy microbiome allow for perfect absorption of nutrients. So things like your vitamin C or zinc or selenium or proteins all are absorbed through those little villi. If the cells are really being impacted in an inflammatory way by either a food that's not tolerated well or a medication or chronic lack of sleep, all of those things make the cell wall proteins weaken. And if those cell wall proteins weaken, those cell wall proteins actually themselves will start to break down and go into the bloodstream. So we have some tests that we do in the office that literally look to see if you're reacting with an antibody reaction to the wall protein of these cells or to the tight junction protein of this mortar and glue between the cells, or if there's even toxins coming from the microbiome and getting into your bloodstream that tell us that this wall is leaky. And that's where the term leaky gut comes from. Leaky gut means that either the cell is letting little particles drift through without any filtering into your bloodstream, or those particles of, we could even say it was of broccoli, little mini microparticles of broccoli could drift through between these broken tight wall junctions into your bloodstream. And so if that were happening, the problem is you're not meant to have broccoli in your bloodstream. You're not meant to have even healthy food in your bloodstream without it having been broken down by going through the cell wall in an appropriate way. So we look at the cell wall as really the way that we have protection from the outside world. And this is an example of the test I run to see if there are breakdown of the cell wall. So this particular test shows that this person has those little tight junctions are starting to get weakened because they're starting to get some of those proteins in the bloodstream, and some of the toxins from the bacteria are also getting into their bloodstream. The way that that works is very much like when we get a vaccine. If the antigen, we call it, comes in, and in this case they're showing a virus, but in all honesty it could even be broccoli, literally. If little microparticles of broccoli are in your bloodstream, your body sends a cell that recognizes them as foreign and uses your T cells to make a memory bank of antibodies. And those antibodies, every time broccoli comes into your system, those antibodies will be called out like a military, like an army, to come fight off the foreigner, even if it's a good thing, because it's not meant to be in your bloodstream. One of the foods that we talk a lot about with gut health is wheat and gluten. And I show this slide just to show you how much we use wheat in our country as compared to other grains. So when I say reduce wheat in your diet, if you reduced wheat in your diet, you would notice that even if you kept eating corn or rice or oats, those in America are consumed at a much, much lower content or amount than all of our wheat products. And so we use wheat overwhelmingly as a major source of our grains in our diet. And that becomes a problem if you have a gut wall that's been beat up and the wheat is going to start going through the gut wall into your bloodstream. And then it becomes an inflammatory molecule. So practical tip number 3, even if you're not sensitive to gluten, I would recommend minimizing processed grain foods in your diet. There's no question that this promotes health. In fact, in all of my work with helping prevent Alzheimer's, and all of my work with balancing blood sugar and lowering cholesterol, this step right here is a foundational step. So when we look at minimizing processed grain foods in your diet, that means anything made with a flour, a wheat flour would be something you'd want to avoid and replace with a whole food. So it's not that you just go replace it with another gluten-free muffin, for instance, because processed grain foods, even if they're not made of wheat, will tend to be something that raises your blood sugar more quickly. But certainly just minimizing wheat and grain in your diet is one major step you can take to decreasing inflammation in your gut. There are certainly other issues that come into play that are other strikes against, in particular, wheat, such as glyphosate that's used at the end of the wheat crop to make it be more productive by making it go to seed right before it's harvested. And so glyphosate in America in our wheat is a problem. And then the other thing is that wheat has been hybridized so that it's very quick to get into our bloodstream and raise our blood sugar. So minimizing processed flour and processed grain foods in your diet has a kind of a threefold benefit. You minimize pesticide exposure, you minimize blood sugar spikes, and you minimize the inflammatory effect of the gluten. There is testing specifically available to test. This is a test that does 24 different subtypes of gluten, and we can test for that to know if you really need to avoid gluten entirely. But for most people, if you reduce gluten, you don't have to necessarily be 100% gluten-free to reap incredible benefits from reducing the gluten. The biggest benefit is lowering of inflammation, and this is really the crux of why I wanted to share some information about your gut for you. You needed to know a little bit about the anatomy of the gut in order for this to make sense, but we know across the board in medicine today that to create health, we need to reduce inflammation. We need to promote perfect function of the body or better function of the body and keep inflammation at a minimum, because inflammation is the very first domino in the steps towards disease. And you can see each of the diseases on this slide, everything from simple arthritis to Alzheimer's disease to cancers and diabetes are all related to inflammation. So the key to reducing inflammation is actually to build a strong gut, because that inflammatory response where the gut wall allows any food products through the gut wall into your small intestine is the biggest source of inflammation in the body. So it's the biggest place we can have an impact. We certainly have heard a lot about inflammation in our society. We keep hearing more and more, and I think the frustrating thing becomes what to do about it, because all of the studies are showing that inflammation in the gut leads to these disease states: depression, autism, mental health illnesses, obesity and diabetes, rheumatoid arthritis and other autoimmune disorders are all impacted by the inflammation that starts in the gut wall when that gut wall starts to break down. So what's the hope out of all of this? What can we do to make it better? So these 4 R's, and you may hear, and you can actually Google the 4 R's to read about what you can do to heal your gut. If we wanted to make the most strong, flexible, wise gut that can sort all the good from the bad and keep you healthy, but not be hurt by inflammation in your gut and not even promote inflammation by being leaky and letting food particles come through, what would we do? This is the guide. So just know we will post on our XO page when we're going to do our gut module, which will be a 4-week module exploring each of these areas. But these are the bases to healing the gut. So when we talk about removing, we remove toxins or things that cause inflammation. So some things are simple to think about like that. We would remove any infection. So if you have a yeast infection in your gut, we want to actually treat that so that you do not have yeast overgrowth in your gut. Or if you have a high amount of antibiotics that you've had in your system, we're going to want to rebalance and remove that antibiotic impact. So first off is remove the toxins, and that can mean infection, that can mean foods that are inflammatory. Food can be inflammatory for a period of time, and then your body can tolerate it. So in essence, foods are sometimes something you would remove certain foods for a period of time and then replace them back in carefully. Then the replace portion of this is replace what's missing. So when we say replace what's missing, we're talking about things like if you need acid to digest your food, or if you need digestive enzymes to help with your digestion. And I think of those things kind of like life jackets. It's not that you would need to take them the rest of your life. You take them while we heal the gut. And then we re-inoculate the gut with good bacteria, and the fermented foods are one piece of that puzzle, but there's a whole bunch of other strategies about re-inoculating the gut. And then we also work to repair the gut. One of the kind of vicious circles that happens with the gut is that if those villi are getting to be more like Berber carpet instead of shag carpet, you have less absorption of nutrients. So if we're not absorbing enough of your B vitamins or enough of your selenium, we don't have the capacity in the body then to actually make enough digestive enzymes. And it becomes a vicious circle that your digestion gets worse because you can't absorb the things you need to make the digestive enzymes in order to absorb the things you need. So repairing includes adding things like glutamate and vitamin D, and very specific regimens that are usually individualized because all of us are missing different vitamins or different enzymes, and we can know that through some of the testing we do of the gut wall and of your nutrient status. So I'm going to invite you to dig in and learn more about your gut. I would like to help you heal your gut, and if you have questions, please use our Facebook page as a place to interact or connect, or call our office. Our office phone number is 760-573-2761. We can make an appointment for you to do a gut overview and look and see what testing you need to heal your gut. And I thank you all for being with us, and stay tuned for more information each week here on our EXO Health page on Facebook. Thank you.